Hello, I'm going to do a video response of sorts to the Ben Shapiro versus Cenk Uygur debate that happened at Politicon 2017. Since I'm not pulling video from the event and putting it into this due to space constraints, and plus I don't want to get hit by copyright claims and all that kind of stuff, I recommend you watch that video before I'm watching this commentary here, as some of what I say won't be clear unless you watch that beforehand, and of course I'll provide the link in the description below. So I can't think of much to rebut that Ben Shapiro didn't successfully do so, but I will point out some of the things I think Ben ignored due to time constraints, and I believe there was a little bit of a gish gallop on the part of Cenk, and that's where someone meanders on and on about several different points and not giving the opponent enough time to address or refute them all. And Ben, I think, did a little bit of that as well, but it's not, I don't think it's intentional on either of their part. It's just you start rambling and getting into this topic you want to bring up and all the points you want to mention. And so that's basically what happened here. So, one of the things I noticed was Cenk was arguing popularity and polling on the healthcare issue as if popularity in and of itself is some sort of justification for something, as if, like, if you remember the old saying about like two wolves and a sheep, deciding what they're having for dinner, popularity or even democracy isn't always a guarantee for a just outcome. So just because a lot of people are not wanting Obamacare to be completely repealed doesn't necessarily mean that it's a just set of laws and executive orders. So, that's just something I wanted to mention. Also, health care for all isn't actually a guarantee that everyone gets health care. Ben sort of touched on that, but I don't think he was able to expand on it much due to, again, time constraints. Someone has to provide that health care, and if you make healthcare unprofitable, then less people will on their own pursue a job with an insurer or work as an insurer or be on that side of the thing. So if you make being a taxi driver completely not worth doing, through government regulation, taxi drivers will go away, and and there'll be other means that come about even through like a black market for that event to occur. So when you make health insurance that unprofitable and you make it, there's a lot of things you can do to essentially make insurance, the quality of it and the quantity of it, go down regardless of the amount of government force that's used. Honestly, who works for no profit? If you have the option of doing something for profit or the same thing for no profit, you'll choose profit. Or you may even do something entirely different if it's for profit compared to what you want to do and there's no profit motive, and that could be due to a need, for food and electricity and rent and other things like that. But bottom line is profit is a powerful motivator. Even if you end up doing something you don't want to do, you will do it for the sake of earning a profit. And using the government to essentially control that or distort that is an issue, and I don't think this was quite covered as well as it could have been in the debate. So just wanted to throw that out. Cenk also argues that insurance is directly the wealthy subsidizing the poor, but he leaves out the fact that insurance by its nature is optional. You pay for insurance on the chance that you might need it in the future, and so it's voluntary. But when a government or someone else makes it mandatory for you to pay, that's coercive in nature. And or even if you don't make them pay like by law, but you punish them financially for not paying, even though that's done indirectly through law, that's, no matter how you broach a subject, that's tyrannical in its very nature. So the thing people like me on the right are against, we're against tyranny, and tyranny isn't exclusive to the left or the right. But when you make the government force people to do something against their will, that's tyrannical by its very nature. Cenk also mentions in the debate that conservatives consider the 1950s and 1960s the golden era, but the thing is, no one really wants to go back to then, pre-internet, pre all these luxuries we have, et cetera, and this is one of the biggest straw men on what conservatism is and what we conservatives believe, or classical liberals, whatever you want to call it. And I thought that was disappointing that he had pulled that out as a point. Cenk also talks about how we all pay taxes, but not everyone does so voluntarily. And we're paying the government more than what we would willingly pay for them. And no one pays the government more than what the government actually takes from them in the form of taxes. So, I mean, these are sort of the issues that complicate his thing. Not just the fact that not everyone pays taxes, and many people that pay taxes get the bulk of it back, or they get bonuses, back if they have kids, or due to a variety of other circumstances. So I thought that he was poorly offering that as a debate point. Also, Cenk gets wrong that the idea that high taxes, don't lead to slower growth, or that it didn't at some point back in time. Growth will occur despite high taxes, but the higher the taxes, the harder it is to grow. That's the core issue that doesn't go away. By its very nature, taxation slows growth, just as by their very nature, laws restrict freedom. You can find exceptions, but they don't invalidate the rule. And if taxes were lower back then, we would have had faster growth than we did with the higher taxes. And that was sort of whitewashed in that discussion. Cenk also talks about a balance of the right amount of taxes, as if that's somehow crucial to getting the right amount of growth. And the problem is there's no consistency in that sort of application. Why is 45% better than 30%? What businesses suffer less from higher taxation than other businesses? And for how long does that last? When the unforeseen happens, not known, to the people who set these tax rates, are there any guarantees, if something doesn't occur, if a business, starts to fail because the taxes are too high, on and on and on. This sort of centralized planning sounds great if you're one of the planners, not if you're one of the millions of people forced to do what the government tells you. I don't know how Cenk's claim of balance occurs that's the same for everyone and has to remain the same year after year and doesn't involve literally picking winners and losers through government force. A lot of debate is around this issue of whether or not healthcare is a right. The only people that say that healthcare is a right on the right side of the political spectrum are in terms of being able to obtain it through voluntary transactions. Like, I have the right to pursue healthcare if I choose, or opt out of it. And we don't necessarily want to have the government force me to get insurance, or force a third party to give it to me, or having, to be forced to go through a third party that I don't want instead of another third party, or being forced to pay for insurance that I don't want, or pay for coverage of things that I can't possibly have, like a uterus or whatever, or punishing me for not paying for health care at all, through mandates or whatever. The difference between a GoFundMe or a Kickstarter or even a charity and taxation is I can voluntarily choose one, whereas the other gives me no choice, and the money is taken from me, practically speaking, at gunpoint by the government. I mean, if the government's taking money from you and you don't let them, what do you think happens? They tend to go after you, and they use force to get that money. You can argue whether or not it's just or not, but when the government comes for your money, you'll be thinking twice about, well, maybe the government shouldn't take this money from me. Maybe I need it more than the government, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not sure I agree with Cenk's argument that Congress shouldn't represent the donors, since they're also people. That's the thing, is it's not like donors are a class of people that aren't people. It's just whether or not they have too much influence for being who they are. I understand the desire is not to give them higher preference than everyone else that doesn't donate. But even if I see to this point, I'd say the goal is to decrease government power so that the special interest groups like businesses or unions can't have undue influence, or individuals. And I'll say that I commend Cenk for making a bold stand that he supports unions, not just corporations, being prohibited from becoming a corrupting influence on the government, even though I disagree with, his argument for doing so. And switching to the next topic that was covered in this debate, investors in banks gambling with people's money, as they say, is not privatizing profits and publicizing losses. It's all done with the same money, that of the people's. Whether or not you want to call it one or the other, it's all the same, and therefore it's all consistent. But people willingly give the bank money. And when this occurs, they should be able to take their money elsewhere. Or if it fails, that's another issue. But the way he phrased this issue is wrong from an argumentative standpoint, and it doesn't hold water. And Ben touches on this issue by discussing corporatism, but I think the explanation is incomplete, likely due to time constraints. So Cenk joking about government forcing corporations or banks to make money is not what anyone is arguing. What Ben argued is that government provided incentive by guaranteeing the banks with regard to their poor investments and subsidizing losses that occurred through bad decisions. And that's something the right was actually against, even though ultimately the banks ended up being bailed out. And let me talk about this issue of corporatism. Corporatism is only one end of the problem of crony capitalism as a larger issue that both the left and the right are against. Hard to believe that both the left and the right, at least the ideologues and the intellectuals and the elites and the average person on both sides, are against crony capitalism. So let me explain why corporatism is only half the issue. Corporatism is essentially a bunch of people getting together and being a part of a business, either as employees or employers or investors or blah, blah, blah. That's corporatism, right? And you can obviously get an unusual amount of control simply by being in a very large corporation. They can do a lot of things that the average handful of people or a smaller group of people can't do due to financial and other things. But that's just corporatism in and of itself. That's pro-business. That's business at an absurd extreme where they can be corrupted, within a market, free or otherwise. The other end of that is governmentalism, and that's where the exact same thing occurs, but as a mirror. That's governmentalism versus corporatism. Governmentalism is essentially a bunch of people in government getting undue power or influence or money or whatever, and then essentially being corrupted and doing the wrong thing and not adequately representing the people that voted for them and downstream stuff like that. So just like bad can occur on pro-business and all this kind of stuff, it can occur from government, through elections and democracy and republics and all this kind of stuff. It can happen through, voluntary transactions and hiring and all that kind of stuff. And there's a whole litany of comparisons, and these are mirror issues. Those two factors combined, governmentalism and corporatism, they end up being crony capitalism. And that's what both sides should be against. And that occurs through tyranny, through the use of force, through government and or business, or both, colluding. And so what we on the right tend to do, we want to minimize government, and the only protections, that government would have would be just in its giving it its ability to protect individual rights. Whereas business, we also don't want this unlimited power to business because that same potential for corruption exists, and there can be tyranny through that sort of a change. But again, that can be protected through a government, either voluntary government through means that are beyond the scope of this video, to the more traditional governments that we have that everyone is familiar with for thousands and thousands of years. And so the goal, in my opinion, is to fight against tyranny on both ends. And I thought that this issue wasn't accurately captured in this debate, unfortunately. Now let me go into this next debate issue that they had really touched on, whether or not money is speech. Cenk argued that money is essentially property, and Ben argued essentially money is speech. My point is a little bit different, and allow me to explain so you'll see how this forms. So I want to try to better frame this issue for those that watched it and felt maybe incomplete. I think I can help that. So even if you consider money property, that doesn't mean you don't have the right to do with your property whatever the hell you want, so long as it doesn't hurt anyone. So if I buy a sonic screwdriver because it's from Doctor Who, I should be able to do whatever the hell I want with it, so long as I don't bop someone over the head with it, right? Speech is associated with liberty and money with property, the way I look at it. And I don't pretend to be the ultimate expert on this. This is how I try to associate it when discussing with others, as I'm discussing with you here. But people like me believe we have a right to our own property, as we do have a right to other individual liberties like speech, free speech. That's what makes them rights, because they don't require force or collusion from others for them to exist. And we can use them also without being violent to others, without physically doing harm. That's why people like me also argue that speech doesn't in and of itself do harm. money is equated with speech by so many because speech and property are both inherent individual rights. So it's not even important that you, if you're on the right debating this issue, that you equate money with speech unless you're talking to someone that doesn't believe in property rights. You can see this point so long as you make it clear that these two, property and speech, are equivalent rights that both need protection. So do you believe you have the right to live? Do you believe you have the right to be free? Do you believe you have the right to own property and do with it what you will, provided you don't hurt anyone with it? If you do have these rights, why do you have them? Does government give them to you, or do you have them regardless of the government, despite government? A pattern you'll see from tyrants is a marginalization of those rights in reverse order typically. First property, then liberty, and then life. And going on to the next issue, I don't think Ben has ever said the left is inherently big government. It wouldn't surprise me if he does, because that's a common belief on the right. But he's pretty sophisticated, so usually if he said something like that, it'd be with caveats or with a greater understanding from context he would provide earlier in, say, a speech or whatever. Anyways, the left may or may not be inherently big government, but it is often bigger government than the right based on the nature of politics. Democrats have historically essentially been the pro-government party, and Republicans are essentially the less government party. Note I say not completely anti-government party. Both parties are willing to use the government for ends that they want, to enforce their respective morality or lack thereof, etc., etc. The left typically wants entitlements, and the right typically wants military. I thought that issue was somewhat fairly represented there. But you'll see that some people on the right want some entitlements, and some people on the left want some military, especially if you want to protect the government that's providing all these entitlements. And then there's issues like the police and other types of careers from that. And then there's supplemental debates on what role the press should have. Should it be funded by the government? If so, how is it protected from government influence? Anyways, I'll digress from there. But these are all partial aspects of the divide, not exclusive to it. This whole pro-military versus pro-entitlement, et cetera, et cetera. The reason why Republicans tend to back the military is because it's there ostensibly, or at least contextually, to protect your individual liberties. And many Republicans are against the military being used haphazardly like it's been in the past. You might look at the paleoconservative versus neoconservative divide on the right for examples. Also, the line about the government being in the woman's uterus. The only reason Republicans advocate, against abortion is because the fetus is a living human, and we want to protect human life. It's not because we don't care about women or want to be in women's uterus. This is just simple biology and the way things work. So I thought that was a bad straw man, bordering into red herring territory as well, because it was just kind of out there. Anyways, I'll digress. But going back to the point I was talking about, the money out of politics argument is essentially whether or not the money is directly transactional in a quid pro quo, as in a return, on an investment, that kind of deal, or is it charity, or is it a financial agreement, like a buy-in on profits, or, a stake within a company or its shares, or if actions will be taken by the company or politician invested in because of that money. So totally get that this is a very nuanced debate here. But are people innocent until proven guilty or not? In my opinion, you punish someone if bribery occurs, but if none occurs, then why prevent money from being given? So that's the issue with this whole wall debate in terms of money. You want to put up a wall, and then you have people prove that they're giving money for certain approved reasons, and if they don't meet that, then they can't give money. That's tyrannical by its very nature, and I'm not really a fan of that. Crony capitalism exists explicitly because of the undue influence of government on business and business on government. You can also substitute business with any other group like a union or political group, or even individuals who give money to the government, in return for something. Cenk mentions that money isn't in the First Amendment, but I think he meant Declaration of Independence with its life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness line. When the line in question is life, liberty, and property, when Ben used it, and that's the original three aspects, that conservative is essentially based on. And money, at least according to Cenk, and I tend to agree with him on this, money is, as he says, property. It's actually dangerous to say that because money isn't in the Constitution, that we don't have the right to spend money. If money is property, we have the right to do with it as we please. And we shouldn't be given permission by the government to do what we want with our stuff by default. Wouldn't you agree? Cenk does make some good points about the money wasted in wars, could have been spent better elsewhere, or perhaps given back to the people. But whatever, I don't agree that the money needs to necessarily go into more entitlements or eliminating more freedom and destroying the free market further. It's highly regulated enough as it is, in my opinion. Cenk is wrong in claiming that the right invented identity politics. Anyone with any knowledge of history knows that identity politics, didn't start with Republicans and the Southern strategy in the 1960s. That was about getting white voters in the South, essentially. Identity politics predated that and has never been exclusive to race or limited by it. The right actually believes that whites and blacks not only should have the same rights, but actually do, and want to prosecute actual occurrences of racism when it occurs, not seek blanket cures based on race or other arbitrary identifiers. The big reason today why whites are the largest race group voting for Republicans and the other races combined to essentially vote for Democrats along with the white minority group is because the Democrats have since the 60s been flipping from whites as their primary constituents to a focus on minority races and LGBT groups and disabled people and other things like that. Any sort of marginalized or minority groups, and trying to essentially group them as a majority and try to tip that as a balance. And because of that flip, when the Democrats began to target whites as the enemy, that's essentially what caused whites to sort of drift more as a demographic group towards Republicans. Because if whoever you are, by whatever identifiers you have, if you have one party that's for you and one party that's against you, it's more likely you are going to go for the party that you identify with. And that's where this identity politics comes from. It's a literal reason for it. And that's why I don't immediately cast off identity politics as absolutely nothing. When you make identity the issue and not the actual politics, like socialism versus capitalism, authority versus liberty, or other things like that, then you do a disservice to that identity-focused agenda. Also, keep in mind, Cenk mentioned equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. And that's something I've seen the left do more and more. But the issue there is to what extent do you involve the government in this to enforce equality of opportunity, and what are you willing to sacrifice in that process? Ultimately, you're going to sacrifice individual rights. Those who believe we don't have a right to life, liberty, or property are more likely to use the government coercion to their desired ends. And that does not mean the left is always more tyrannical than the right. After all, there are plenty of right-wingers who don't do a good job of fighting for individual rights, but they don't try to enable or enforce collective rights in the process. And that's going to do it from our response video to this debate. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.